We're going to get started here. My name is Penny Wright, and some of you we know, and we have a few new faces. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming here. Julia and I were trying to reconstruct how we connected, and I believe we connected because Julia was one of the recommended speakers in connection with Library Long Island Reads, which is an island-wide reading marathon that happens in this time of year. So, and I mentioned her to a couple of other people who do programs, and they had very high praise for her. So we were all the more glad that she was coming here today. Oh, I do want to mention that in a month or so, we have a program about women spies in World War II. We probably have the flyers out, but if we don't, we'll make sure we put them here by the time you go, because you will want to come to that too, we hope. Julia Lauria-Blum earned her BA in Visual Arts at SUNY New Paltz, and after a brief career in the hospitality industry, she pursued her interest in aviation history and began researching women in aviation. In 2001, she curated the WASP exhibit at the American Air Power Museum in Farmingdale, New York, and received the 2003 Women's History Award from the Women's Equality Committee of NOW. She was a consultant on the History Channel documentary titled Women Combat Pilots, The Right Stuff, you may have seen it, and later curated 3 exhibits at the American Air Power Museum: the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II, Women War Correspondents of World War II, and 90 Nurses, International Organization of Women. She is currently the Archivist and Curatorial Assistant at the Cradle of Aviation Museum in Garden City, which we may take a trip to. So, please welcome Julia Lauria-Blum. I should have been wearing them. I didn't see that they were up here.
Hey, let's get the show on the road. Thank you, Penny, for that lovely introduction. Everybody here, please do come out to the American Air Power Museum. It's open Thursdays through Sundays, and it's a time capsule. It really is a very interesting place, as well as the Cradle of Aviation in Garden City. It's a bit of a hike for you, but it's worth the trip. Thank you so much for coming today, for your interest in the Women Air Force Service Pilots. As Penny said, I have an exhibit on them at the American Air Power Museum, which opened in 2001 in the presence of 8 WASP who traveled from different states to be there, and was dedicated by Governor George Pataki. In 1918, after the onset of World War I, American aviation pioneer Ruth Law wrote an article entitled "Let Women Fly." And in it she stated, "There is a world-old controversy that crops up whenever women attempt to enter a new field. Is a woman fit for that work? It would seem that a woman's success in any particular field would prove her fitness for that work, without regard to theories to the contrary." Although flying was what she and many of her colleagues wanted to do for the war effort in World War I, their ambition would not be realized at that particular time. In late to mid-1930s, as the Axis formed under Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Emperor Hirohito in Europe and the Pacific, and on the day after German tanks rolled into Warsaw, Poland in September of 1939, noted American pilot Jackie Cochran sent a letter to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt urging the use of women pilots to train in and fly military aircraft for an impending national emergency on the American home front, certain of the inevitable involvement of the United States in a war that no longer seemed distant. Cochran foresaw a dire shortage of male pilots who would be needed for overseas combat duty. Shortly thereafter, another accomplished pilot, Nancy Harkness Love, wrote to the Ferry Division of the Army Air Force with a similar suggestion, in which she would recruit the most qualified women pilots to fill the vacancy of male pilots in the United States and ferry military aircraft to and from military air bases and ports of embarkation in the United States for the delivery of aircraft overseas, thus releasing male pilots for overseas combat duty. The Army Air Force, however, was not yet ready to put women in the cockpit of its military aircraft, and both Love and Cochrane's ideas were put on the shelf. This is Nancy Love at Roosevelt Field in 1936, and the aforementioned Jackie Cochrane received her pilot's license at Roosevelt Field. She was a cosmetologist who wanted to start a business of her own, and she met a prestigious businessman by the name of Floyd Odlum, who said, "You're going to need wings to do that." So on her vacation, she got her pilot's license at Roosevelt Field in 3 weeks. Hence, on a quiet Sunday morning in December of 1941, pilot and flight instructor Cornelia Fort, a former debutante from Tennessee, was flying with a student named Sumala, who was to solo that very day after practicing takeoffs and landings. After rising from the runway at John Rogers Airfield, below to the west lay Pearl Harbor, with its crowded but still dormant naval base. Just 22 years old and a pilot of less than 2 years, Cornelia was one of the nation's most experienced flyers, earning her commercial and instructor's certificates within a year. Leaving behind her family's Nashville estate in October, she had been working at Honolulu's Andrews Flying Service. Just prior to the landing Cornelia was going to have her student make, before he soloed, she looked around and saw a military plane coming in from the sea. Being used to military traffic and respective safety zones, she noted his position and turned to look around to see if it was clear to make the final turn into the field. Suddenly, a plane came directly towards hers and at the same altitude. She jerked the controls away from her student, jammed the throttle wide open in order to pull above the oncoming plane. As he passed so closely under them, the celluloid windows rattled violently, and she looked down to see what kind of plane it was. Fort would later recount in the woman's home companion, the painted red balls on the tops of the wing shone brightly in the sun. I looked again with complete and utter disbelief. Honolulu was familiar with the emblem of the rising sun on passenger ships, but not on airplanes. I looked quickly at Pearl Harbor, and my spine tingled when I saw billowing black smoke. Still, I thought hollowly it might be some kind of coincidence, or maybe maneuvers. It must be. It might be, for dearly sure God, how could this be? Then I looked way up, and I saw formations of silver bombers riding in. I saw something detach itself from the plane and come glistening down. My eyes followed it, and my heart convulsed when the bomb exploded in the middle of the harbor. I knew then the air was not the place for my little baby airplane, and I set about landing it as quickly as ever I could. As Cornelia taxied toward the hangars, she recalled, "A few seconds later, I saw a shadow pass over me and simultaneously saw bullets spattering all around me. Then she and Sumala jumped from the airplane and sprinted for cover. Bullets tore into the tiny plane behind them. Suddenly, she recalled, that little wedge of sky above Hickam and Pearl Harbor was the busiest, fullest piece of sky I ever saw." December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. And on that day, 2,403 Americans died, 68 of them civilians, 1,178 were wounded, 18 ships were sunk or run aground, and all the Americans killed or wounded during the attack were non-combatants, given the fact there was no state of war when the attack occurred. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the United States was plunged into a war on two fronts, in the Pacific and Europe. The entire country mobilized overnight to form a united front in the war against the Axis. The opportunity for women and minorities to take part in previously male-dominated roles and work presented itself as it had never before. The furious increase in the production of materials for the war machine resulted in an acute labor shortage as enlisted men were sent overseas, and as well as a shortage of male pilots needed to ferry military aircraft and be released for overseas combat duty. Women would enlist in branches of the U.S. military that included the WWII, Women's Army Corps, the WWIIs, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service in the Navy, the SPARs, Semper Paratus, Always Ready with the Coast Guard, and the Women Reservists, or Women Marines. In 1942, Eleanor Roosevelt stated in her My Day column, "This is not a time when women should be patient. We are in a war, and we need to fight it with all our ability and every weapon possible. Women pilots, in this particular case, are a weapon waiting to be used." In answer to Jackie Cochran's 1939 proposal to allow women pilots to fly for the military, Commanding General of the Army Air Force, Henry Hap Arnold, asked that Cochran travel to England to observe the Wings for Britain program and the Air Transport Auxiliary, in which women pilots were already serving as ferry pilots. He then promised Cochran that if a similar program was formed in the United States, that she would be the one to direct it. She flew in a Hudson bomber over the pond, but she was not permitted to take off or land in the plane because she was a woman. Later that year, as the shortage of male pilots grew to desperate proportions, officials of the Army Air Forces remembered Nancy Love's proposal, and she was only then assigned to recruit a small experimental group of 28 of the most highly qualified women pilots as civil servants to transition into military aircraft in Newcastle Army Air Base, Delaware, and to learn how to fly the Army way. The first group of these exceptional pilots had to have a minimum of 500 hours and were called the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, or WAFs. Nancy Love would be the director. The third woman to report was Cornelia Fort. Fort wrote in her journal, "Because there were and are so many disbelievers in women pilots, especially in their place in the Army, officials wanted the best possible qualifications to go with the first experimental group. All of us realized what a spot we were on. We had to deliver the goods, or else there wouldn't ever be another chance for women pilots in any part of the service." For the WAFs, transition into military aircraft was approximately 1 month long and mostly in light aircraft. Their first ferrying assignment took place October 22nd, 1942, from the Piper factory in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, to Mitchell Field, Long Island. Later, the WAFs would transition into heavier, faster aircraft. When Jackie Cochran learned of the start of the WAFs program, she returned to the United States from Great Britain in a flurry and confronted General Arnold regarding his promise to her to direct a large-scale, full military training and operations program for the female pilots of the United States. General Arnold then approved a broad-scale, comprehensive program that would teach many classes of women pilots with less experience than the WAPs to fly military aircraft. It was called the Women's Flying Detachment, or the WFTD. Initial requirements for this program was a minimum of 200 hours. Using civil aeronautics records, an urgent call went out for women pilots to fly military aircraft. At this time, the Air Force was not a separate branch of the military. It was under the auspices of the United States Army Air Force. As such, at this time of emergency, the women pilots would be recruited as a detachment of the Army Air Force as temporary civil servants with the promise of legislation of military status which awaited action in Congress. The first class reported to Ellington Municipal Airport in Houston, Texas. They were referred to as the guinea pigs. It's class 43, W1. 1943, W for women, class number 1. Their training was 6 months. 25,000 applications were received, 1,830 were accepted for training, and 1,074 graduated, and there were a total of 18 classes. As the Houston training base outgrew its facilities, a move to a more accommodating space and larger was found at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas by Jackie Cochran. I was in Sweetwater, Texas in 2000, and it has not changed much from this picture. It is also known as the rattlesnake capital of the United States. Military training for the women was identical to male cadets, except acrobatics, since they would not be flying in combat, which encompassed ground school, flight school, physical fitness training, engines, meteorology, and more. Sweetwater, Texas, Avenger Field. The levels of flight training were, as with the males, primary, basic, advanced, and after each level, the women would be flight checked by male instructors before they would move on to the next level. If they did not pass the flight check, they were washed out and immediately sent home at their own expense. The recruits of the flight detachment lived in barracks, ate in the mess halls, marched to school, and lived according to military standards. When the women trainees first arrived at Avenger Field, it was being used as a base for Royal Air Force cadets. So for a very brief time, Avenger Field was co-ed. But the RAF cadet program was then quickly moved out, and it became solely an all-female training facility. Since the women's training program was considered experimental and rather secret, the behavior of each and every woman was expected to be exemplary, lest the risk of endangering the program's success and its continuation. For this reason, trainees were not permitted to fraternize with enlisted or commissioned officers. Once word got out of this experimental program at a female-only training base, male pilots flying in the vicinity began radioing in false maydays, which would permit forced landings at Avenger. After Cochran caught wind of this stunt, she abruptly put an end to it, and Avenger then became known as Cochran's Convent. As the female civilian trainees were not yet issued regulation uniforms, in order to appear more official, the recruits purchased khaki pants, white shirts, and overseas caps. After successful completion of all 3 phases of flight training, the first several classes of the flight detachment were assigned to the ferry command with the WAFs. Ferry command bases at that point expanded from Newcastle, Delaware, and new graduates of the flight detachment were assigned to Newcastle, Romulus, Michigan, Dallas, Long Beach, and Palm Springs, California. Subsequent classes of the Women's Flight Training Detachment were assigned to the Training Command at over 120 Army air bases within the United States. In August of 1943, Nancy Love's WAFs and Jackie Cochran's Women's Flying Training Detachment became known as the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. They were issued Santiago blue uniforms with silver wings, and promised militarization was still pending in Washington. These are some of the tasks that the women performed. In addition to ferrying, those that went to the training detachments flew engineering flights, test and demonstration flights, check and safety pilots, administrative flights, flight instruction, towing targets for anti-aircraft, aerial gunnery, gliders, tracking and searchlight missions, simulated strafing and smoke laying, chemical missions, radio, drone, controlled flights, and the very first experimental jet. These two women here, Dorothea Mormon and Dora Dougherty, were two pilots that were chosen to learn how to fly the B-29. At the time of its rollout, thereabouts, the B-29 was experiencing some engine fire issues, and male pilots started to refuse to fly them. So Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets came up with an idea. Let's recruit two WASP, and in approximately 2 weeks, train them how to fly the B-29, the largest bomber in the cadre of Army Air Force bombers. At that point, after they were all set up to fly and checked out, they had a little demonstration. They lined the male cadets up and had the B-29 fly in and land. The air stairs came down, the two women came out of the plane, and the men never had another problem flying the B-29 after that. Dora Dougherty, in her later senior years, I believe, received a letter from one of those cadets who thanked her for making him feel comfortable with flying the B-29. They would later go on to become married. So the story goes. Republic Aviation Corporation, the home of the mighty P-47 Thunderbolt. This picture is of 4 WASP at Farmingdale, the control tower that still stands today. You can see on the left, the lower left side. These women were assigned, about a group of 18 WASP were assigned on temporary duty from Newcastle Army Air Base, 2nd Ferrying Division, to ferry P-47s from the production line to Newark, New Jersey, where the aircraft was then put on ships and sent overseas. The women were then ferried back in a cargo plane, mostly piloted by a WASP, back to Farmingdale, where they would pick up another aircraft and ferry back and forth, back and forth. And in the second half of 1944, every single P-47 off the production line was flown by a woman, a WASP, on its first leg of its journey into combat. On September 1944, the 10,000th P-47 rolled off the Republic assembly line. Teresa James, one of the original WAFs to join the ferry division, was chosen to fly 10 grand from Republic Aviation in Farmingdale to its port of embarkation in Newark, New Jersey, for its shipment overseas. She attended the opening of the exhibit in 2001. Quite a lady. As the war progressed, and the WASP who graduated was successfully carrying out all the duties that they were assigned, the war in the European theater of operation was becoming more of a ground war. Thus, the flight training programs were being shut down, and previously draft-deferred civilian flight instructors who did not qualify for overseas flight duty were threatened with induction into the infantry. Suddenly, these civilian male pilots, who had previously been uninterested in the work that the women were doing, wanted their jobs. This relatively small vocal group began a letter-writing crusade, petitioning that the women be replaced by them, that the program be shut down, claiming the WASP were just lazy glamour girls who were taking piloting jobs away from men. A vicious smear campaign was launched with the avid assistance of noted journalist Drew Pearson, and thus ultimately the bill to militarize the women failed by a mere 19 votes. Thus, the WASP would be abruptly disbanded despite the fact that there was plenty of work to do and airplanes sitting in production facilities waiting to be ferried. The WASP offered to stay on for $1 a year, but their offer was refused. At the final graduation ceremony of Class 44W10 on December 7th, 1944, exactly 3 years from the bombing of Pearl Harbor, General Henry Hap Arnold said, "Frankly, I didn't know in 1941 whether a slip of a young girl could fight the controls of a B-17 in heavy weather. Well now, in 1944, we can come to only one conclusion. The WASP have completed their mission. You have proven yourself to fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers. But as in war, it has not come without cost." 38 WASP died while helping their country move toward the moment of final victory. Cornelia Fort was the first WASP to die on operational duty in service to country when another aircraft collided with her BT-13, which she was ferrying over Merkel, Texas, on March 21st, 1943. Technically considered civilians, WASP trainees and graduates were denied military burial. They were not entitled to any death benefits. The family was not permitted to display the gold star in the home's window, showing the loss of their daughter, their wives, their sisters, their aunts. And in some cases, the WASP had to take up collections to send the bodies home of those that could not afford it, as well as accompanying them on the train to make sure they arrived at their destination, their final resting place. The WASP sent home on December 20th, 1944 at their own expense. Their legacy faded from history and our history books. And then 3 decades later, the Navy announced that for the first time in history, women would be trained to fly military aircraft. The surviving WASP was stirred up after some 30 years of silence. They petitioned and lobbied for veteran status, and with the help of General Hap Arnold's son, Bruce, and Senator Barry Goldwater, and a hard-fought battle, they accomplished that long overdue goal. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed the House bill giving the WASP military recognition. In 1979, veteran status was achieved under Public Law 95-202. The WASP were the first women to serve as pilots and fly military aircraft for the Army Air Force. There were 28 original WAFs under the command of Nancy Love. WASP served in the Army Air Force from September 1942 to December 20th, 1944. 25,000 applied for the training detachment, Cochrane's program. 1,830 were accepted, and 1,074 graduated from the training program. All in all, there were 18 classes. The WAFs and the training detachment merged on August 5th, 1943, and were renamed the WASP. They were governed by Civil Service Commission under military discipline orders. They were stationed at 120 Army air bases within the United States, and they flew only within the United States. They did not fly overseas. They flew 78 different types of aircraft, every plane in the Army Air Force arsenal, including the B-29, and in the course of their existence, flew 60 million miles of operational flights. 38 WASP died in training and operational duty. In 2003, the names of 38 WASP killed in the service were read into the congressional record by Congressman Steve Israel. In 2009, President Obama signed the bill granting the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal. In 2010, they received the Congressional Gold Medal at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. In 1943, Cornelia Fort wrote in a letter to her mother, "I loved the sky and the plains, and yet best of all, I loved flying. If I die violently, who can say it was before my time? I was happiest in the sky, at dawn when the quietness of the air was like a caress, when the noon sun beat down, and at dusk when the sky was drenched with the fading light. Think of me there, and remember me, I hope, as I shall you. With love, Cornelia." And that is the story of the WASP. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, I have something that's not really a question,
Yes.
because I guess I just got the answer. I guess it's not WASPs.
No. It's, that would be redundant. It's Women Air Force Service Pilots.
Yeah. So
She was a
one
WASP,
such
they were
person
WASP.
is a WASP and a group.
You'll see it
Group of
spelled
WASP.
both ways, you know. But technically, they were the WASP. And that's not white Anglo-Saxon cars. Yes.
I have a question. There's a woman, I knew she passed away about 5 years ago. She
Mhm.
was a Navy flight instructor
Mhm.
in England at the time.
Mhm.
And she had told me essentially what you're just saying now.
Uh-huh.
You weren't allowed this and that. Do you
Right.
actually have a list of the names?
Of the ATA, the women that flew in England.
Yeah. Well, just in general, maybe she was originally a WASP.
Well, none of the Navy pilots were with the WASP. It was only Army Air Force.
Oh, okay. So
Then you had the ATA girls, the ATA girls, they call them,
So that was.
Air Transport Auxiliary in England, in the fort, during World War II.
Yeah.
Then the women didn't really fly into the military until they announced it in the late 70s. And the pilot who just landed the 737 safely was one of the first ones. So these are her predecessors.
Did you care to comment about her?
I think like any of the pilots that have been trained to conduct themselves and do what she did was wonderful, and it could have been a lot worse. She got that plane down, and unfortunately the one woman died. But she's a hero to me. Yeah.
I was impressed that 25,000 people applied.
Yeah, and as the program continued, the pool of qualified women diminished. So it was reduced from 200 hours to 35 hours needed to fly, to enter the program. And then the age limit was reduced to 18 and a half. It was originally 21, and then it was reduced to 18 and a half. Yeah, they were young, the men and the women. And there is one case that's pretty well documented of a wasp who was towing a target and crashed. The engine went on fire and she died in the flames. And her compatriots demanded that that Jackie Cochran investigate this, because it was the second one in like 2 weeks, and some of these planes were just not, they shouldn't have been flying them, they were red line aircraft. And it was discovered that there was sugar in the tank, which kills an engine immediately. And being that the program was so tenuous and experimental, Cochran didn't pursue it any further, and that was that. There might have been a certain amount of resentment by a mechanic or something, I don't know. A lot of the bases they initially went to, there was resistance, but when they went above and beyond to prove themselves. And the males would ask for them because they did such a great job.
It's amazing when considered history.
Yeah. They went home quietly, they started families. Some of them started their own fixed base operations. Some of them applied for the commercial airlines. They were not going to take women. I know of one in particular that the interviewer said, if you were a man, I'd hire you in a minute. But there were a lot of World War II male pilots returning, and that's the way it was. That was the times.
Did they also work on the plane?
Not the WASP, but in the WACS did, yeah. There were some mechanics. There were about 400,000 women served in all branches of the military during World War II. 400,000. Yeah. And not to mention the civilians. Yes?
My mother applied for the WAC,
WAC. Uh-huh.
and she was not allowed to sign up. And so she and 8 women bought their own plane
Oh.
and were based in Arizona,
Mhm.
and flew search and rescue the whole war.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
So why would have she not been able to get in? It was just cut off at the 1,000.
It depends when she applied, and did she have the hours she needed at that time, and
Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions.
yeah. And there were 2 Asian Americans. There were a couple of African American women that applied, but they could not be accepted, and the reason is segregation. These women didn't necessarily have bases to stay at when they flew because they were civilians. So it was up to them to find their own hotels and whatnot. It would have been very dangerous for an African American woman, in addition to being a woman, being African American, to be walking down the street in Georgia somewhere trying to find a hotel that would even let her stay. I know one WASP, a white woman, who was walking down the street after doing a ferrying mission, and she was arrested. She was wearing pants, which was, not that common, and she was arrested for impersonating an officer. And they put her in a cell, and after a phone call or 2, she was released. They didn't believe, when she told her she told them what she was doing, I never heard of that. Yes.
Isn't there a museum somewhere in Texas or something?
Yes.
Florida?
Yes, in Sweetwater, Texas, yeah, at Avenger Field. It's quite off the beaten path. So it's not going to get the kind of traffic that air power gets. Yeah.
Tell us
Texas,
about your
okay.
museum a little bit.
About the American Air Power Museum, it's a living history museum, and it was started by a group of reenactors or living historians, the 533rd Living History Squadron, whose mission is to bring history to life. So you had men and women dressing in period uniforms and presenting the stories, respective stories of the men and the women. And the Air Power Museum itself is in the original hangars of Republic Aviation, which is only 3 left. And that's right where the P-47 was produced. So when you walk in there, it's very much a time capsule. And we have mostly all World War II operational aircraft. And in fact, we have Henry Hap Arnold's B. Mitchell bomber, and it was his transport plane, and it's one of the oldest operating Mitchell bombers. It was his transport plane.
Can I mention something about the libraries?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, some of you may know this and others may not, but we have an oral history selection here. And it's pretty much all housed in the Long Island room, the reference area. You have to get a librarian to bring them in. It's slow. But in that room, we have manuscripts with oral history interviews, and we have quite a few about World War II. Nurses and people on the home front, and pilots, and we have a lot of World War II stuff that we wish you would read, or
Yeah.
we also have videotapes of a lot of them. And some of you have been to these programs. Of course, this generation is hearing.
Sorry.
But anyway, sometime, ask us, ask the reference, come, and we'll show you what we have. Because we have a lot of stories from them.
Yeah.
Who were,
Right out of the mouths of those who were there.
yeah.
And diminishing population. There's about 50 watts left, I would say, at this point. They're all well into their 90s. The woman that you saw flying the B-17 on the right seat in the current day, she lived to 100, and she passed away last summer, 2 weeks after her 100th birthday. And on the day of her death, outside her window in her house in Finger Lakes, a bald eagle landed outside her window, perched on a tree right outside her window for a few hours, and she passed away, and the eagle left her. I believe left with her soul. Yeah. Dawn Seymour, she was one of the 13 B-17 pilots. Yes.
Have you ever heard of Mrs.
Eller?
Georgia Field?
Oh, no, I don't. No. Is she a wasp?
Believe
Was that
well.
her married name or her maiden?
That was my name.
Yeah, no. Yeah. Yeah, well, they were, like I said, they were 18th, trainees, and as you can see, about only half of them made it in the program. Some names I could tell you, yeah. Yes.
This not having been to study the defaults
No.
and not going into
Yeah.
what grabbed you?
What grabbed me?
Yeah.
Well, I was always interested in aviation. My father was an engineer, an aerospace engineer. And my mother passed away in 1981, and I was visiting her grave. And I came upon the grave of one of the 38 wasps, Alice Lovejoy, and it had a plaque attached to her in the mausoleum describing her service. And I became interested in it, and I couldn't find anything until I got on the internet years later. I was determined. And then I met her namesake about 3 years ago. We had a special ceremony at the Air Power Museum, and it was kind of magical. Yeah.
So, a couple years ago, they had their first get notified, their first float. Was it
Yes,
the-
yeah.
I actually went and volunteered to
Oh.
do that, and I got a chance to meet some of those.
Great. Yeah,
And the interesting thing is, a lot of the families, it was all volunteer, and they were
Right.
and all the families were there. The conversations that were going on in those families
Mhm.
were all about aviation
mm-hmm,
and the planes and
Yeah.
all different things. And these people, the grandchildren and the daughters of these moms, even though they did that band now,
Mhm.
they were raising families, they were always wanting to fly.
right,
All the
Yeah.
time. And they were always, it was very interesting to see, you know, like when you have boys, you got race cars and everything else. These families were all into aviation,
Mhm.
all the time, always talking
Yeah.
about planes and all that kind of stuff.
mm-hmm,
It was amazing
Right.
experience to see them and actually to see some of these women
Right.
who were actually
stayed, they stayed, yeah, and then there were those that just went home and they didn't want to talk about it anymore. You know, it ended badly for a lot of them, and they just wanted to leave that brief period of their life behind. You know.
They're amazing women.
Yes, as all the women that served were, I believe.
During World War II, were there any women, whether in the United States or abroad, who
Not the Americans. The ferry, the air transport auxiliary women, there were a group of 20 Americans strictly ferrying in England. And then there were the Russian night witches who actually flew combat. They called them the night witches. Yeah. And they were combat pilots and they had a great record. Yeah. They had a reunion with them in Russia, actually. Once a group of them went in the 80s, I think, and met them. Yeah. Yes.
Why do you think the decrease, like the 25,000 people had to go in, and then in the end, you could hardly get anybody? What happened there that people lost interest in doing this?
Well, no, I mean, they could only accept a certain amount of women, so they ended up getting, 18 classes, and that's, yeah, and then they canceled the program.
When you said it dropped down to 35 hours, it's
Yes.
absolutely dangerous. I mean, why would you do that if you had this huge group of people who were dying to do this?
Well, they didn't all have the hours. They didn't have 200 initially, so they dropped it down to 35. And they had to be, they had to be interviewed and accepted, and if, Cochrane was in charge of that. So they could only take in a certain amount per class.
Do you think some of the reduced numbers too were because of the fact that we were in the war and the women couldn't learn how to fly?
Right, exactly. It was very expensive, and flying on the East Coast was stopped after, Pearl Harbor and everything. So, it was not a cheap thing to do. A lot of them, they learned through the civilian pilot training program through universities, and they picked one woman out of class of 10 men. One woman would be accepted. So, there was a certain amount that they could take in a class, because they couldn't have hundreds and hundreds in a class. And then it ended. Yes.
There was a lady at Grumman.
Yeah.
That was a transport pilot. I believe her name was Sally, and she was from Eastwood.
There were 3 women that were Hellcat test pilots at Grumman.
Well, she was
That
in
was
the
Navy.
60s, I don't see.
Oh, in the 60s?
Yeah.
And what did she do?
She was, I think, in charge of the ground station there.
Oh, yeah, very
I
possible.
just wondered if you knew her.
No, I didn't. I know the 3 that they were too old to join the WASP. So they were test pilots with Grumman, Hellcat pilots. You had to be, under 30, whatever it was, 32 or whatever. And they were older.
I think you find that the opportunity for anybody to learn how to fly
Yeah,
prior to the Second World War was practically non-existent.
right,
So to get that many hours.
right. It was not easy.
Extreme
Right.
exception.
Right,
And the ladies who flew these
yeah,
were truly,
yes,
truly exceptional pilots.
yes, they were, yeah. I mean, they loved to fly. That's what they didn't do it for the money or the glory or any of that. They were patriotic and they wanted to fly, yeah. This was an opportunity. What an opportunity. And they would have done it again, hands down.
We had year or two ago, Beryl Moore.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Have you read West with the Night?
Yes, that was a book.
Is that beautiful? Is that a
Oh.
beautiful book? Beryl Markham, first woman to fly west from east. She was from South Africa, and she was the Amelia Earhart of,
Yeah.
South Africa. She was a horsewoman, yeah.
Yeah, she was a rip.
Yeah, she was.
Well,
So
goodness,
that's it.
that was so interesting.
Oh, well, you enjoyed it?
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.